All right. Good day, everyone. My name is Fadi Minawi. I'm here with Michelle. I'm from VisaPlace Legal. VisaPlace is a law firm in Canada as well as the U.S. We help with both Canadian immigration and U.S. immigration. Today we do have a special event. I have with me, as I mentioned, Michelle. She has taken the gone through the process and has actually immigrated to the U.S. And I thought it would be a very good topic to bring up today, so that to get it from a an immigrant's perspective. In this case, it's a Canadian immigrating to the U.S. What it would be like, and what was the process like in order to embark through that process with her and her family. Welcome, Michelle.
Hi, Fadi. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you for joining. It's a big move to go from Canada to the U.S., right? And I mean, I think with my every day I get various questions, and sort of compiling all of those types of questions and including it into a sort of a format like this. I think
Right.
it's going to be very helpful for those that are joining us, and for those that want to watch this later on, as this will be uh, recorded and it's going to be also on our YouTube page.
Great. Well, I'm happy to help. Like you, we get asked the same questions all the time,
I'm sure you do.
both from Canadians that we know and also Americans who are just curious, why we came and what it was like. And yeah, so I'm happy to help.
Right. Just a little bit of a background as to the firm itself. So Visa Place has been around for over 25 years. We've helped out thousands of people, thousands of families immigrate to Canada and to the U.S. Myself, I am a U.S. attorney here. I'm also the managing director, and I've personally handled many cases over the years. I've been with the firm for some time now. And Michelle, we certainly helped you out, you and your family go
You
to.
did. You did.
So, I'm just going to get into some of the questions, and I'm sure there's going to be some other questions that come up. But in terms of, I guess, where we can start, maybe you can explain when and why you started thinking of immigrating to the U.S. in the first place.
Sure. So we immigrated, I would say it was about 9 years ago. And it's actually interesting how it came about because I myself was never really interested in going to the US. I mean, I always enjoyed visiting, but never really thought about it in terms of something that myself or my family would do. We were pretty settled. We lived in, a great location, Midtown Toronto. And, I'm sure a lot of Canadians can relate. It's just not the kind of thing you really think of doing, especially, I don't know, maybe being in Toronto. I don't know if it was a cultural thing. But, you grow up, my whole family was there, all our friends were there, we were really settled. And it was really my husband, actually, who was really kind of pushing for this. At the time, he worked out of the house, much, much pre COVID. And in his mind, he was thinking, well, I can work anywhere and I can work in warm weather. So, he brought it up to me a number of times over the years about moving. And, I was always kind of the pushback. And then I think at that point we hit an ice storm, if I recall correctly. And he essentially said, I've had enough. I can't take this cold weather anymore. So for us, it was more weather driven than anything else. And, just thinking also, if he can work from home, in cold weather, he can also work in the warm weather. So, that's essentially was the catalyst for us moving.
Right. And you ended up moving to Florida.
We did. We
Right.
ended up moving to Florida. A lot of Canadians, seem to like Florida because of the warm weather, and
Right.
so that's where we went.
Right. I would say a vast majority of our Canadian clients applying, for example, for an E2, which incidentally, that's how you initially moved to the US,
Right.
end up going to Florida. We have a number. Usually, the sort of the top destinations are Florida, Arizona, California, Texas.
Right.
And and then we've worked with other clients that have been sort of scattered all over the U.S., including Alaska. So not always weather driven, but it is for the most part.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. Initially I was interested in moving to California. I had that
Right,
California dream of living in the Golden State, and we did fly out at one point, and we looked at homes in San Diego, and then we came back, and it was a far flight, and dealing with jet lag and all the other things. So we
right.
ended up going to Florida.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when that moment struck you and you said, okay, we are going to be, moving to the U.S., and you sort of decided on that, how long before you actually took the first steps into, moving on into that process?
Well, I think, once we actually decided we were going to do it and we met with you, I got in touch through somebody that I knew with a real estate agent in Florida. We didn't even know exactly where we wanted to go. So that's, the one thing I would really think about when moving, what your motivation is. Is it weather? Is it, good school districts? Is it, why are you picking certain areas rather than other areas? And
Right.
I mean, that's a real advantage in the United States because, depending on really what you want, there's something for everybody. So for us, it was weather. We liked the idea that there was no state income tax. It was close to Toronto, where our family was. So a lot of things made sense that way.
Right.
So I got in touch with a real estate agent who was fantastic. She asked me a lot of the kinds of questions in terms of our lifestyle, and she just started sending me listings. And then we essentially booked a time and flew out and started, looking at homes. So, we'd considered renting, and then we decided, that we were going to buy as opposed to renting. So that was kind of the first step that we took, that, it really, reality kind of set in that we were doing this.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, and if I may just add, because I do remember clearly your matter, in terms of the paths and visas that were considered, I know we looked at an intercompany transfer because in this case there was a foreign business in
Right.
Canada, and there's a business that was set up in the U.S. So that was one aspect that we looked at, but what we actually honed in on and actually used was something called an E2 visa. So the
Right.
E2 visa is not necessarily related to a foreign Canadian business, but it's meant to be a pathway for an investor that may qualify to actually set up a business, show that there's a substantial investment in that business, and that the business was not marginal. And I think the reasoning between an L1 and the E2 in terms of that that consideration, we ultimately decided on the E2 because I mean I know your situation. You picked up and you went to the U.S. right with your family.
Yes.
That's a big move. With the L1, we would have been limited with a 1 year status in the U.S. and then you know you're gonna have to be coming back and asking for an extension. That
Right.
extension can be had for depending, but 2 or 3 years at a time.
Yeah.
Whereas with the E2, it was right off the bat. It was a 5 year visa. At least that's what it is for Canadians. So that made that made the option really attractive, right? In that case, because hey, you
Yeah.
know what? It's a big move. You don't want to pick up and move for a 1 year status, which you're gonna have to go and worry about reapplying for an extension in a matter of maybe eight months or so.
No,
So
absolutely. And Fatty, that really, if you recall, that really worked for us in our lifestyle because at the time when we left, I had two young kids. My son was just entering high school. We had dogs that we were taking with us. And psychologically, it was just easier to feel much more committed to making it work, knowing that we had that period of time. And as you mentioned, it really is a huge move. I mean, just getting settled in a new country. There were just a lot of things to take care of in the beginning.
right,
So it made it feel that much more worthwhile knowing that we were going to be there for a while.
right. And what were some of your concerns before you actually went through with this process?
Uh, well, we had a lot of concerns. I mean, just in terms of, lifestyle, one of the biggest things as a Canadian that we're all used to and at the time, very comfortable with is knowing that we had universal health care. So that was a question for us. What is healthcare going to be like there? How are we going to get it? Is it going to be affordable? So, in answer to that question, what we did is we got in touch pretty quickly with a broker because healthcare in the US is like a business. I mean, fortunately, in the state of Florida, there's no state income tax. So, we financially, we saved in certain areas and therefore paying monthly insurance fees for the healthcare. Yes, it's not inexpensive, but there's a lot of choices that you have. And so, it ended up being just fine for us. And so we were able to get healthcare pretty quickly. I have to say that the healthcare has been terrific. We were able to get a doctor, we could see a specialist pretty easily. And the good thing is, as I mentioned, there was flexibility. So, my husband, for example, is on one type of plan, myself and the kids are on another type of plan. So there's a lot of, flexibility. So that was one of the issues that we had was healthcare. Another one was, how would we make friends? We left our friends, we were very, very settled in Canada. So what I did, for example, was I'd never played tennis before. I joined a tennis team, which was great. So I was able to meet people. And then my husband was able to meet, our friends and their husbands, I should say. We made friends through the kids' school. So the schooling was another issue. So when we flew down to look at where we were going to live, we looked at all the different schools. We looked at the school ratings. We interviewed people in the neighborhoods we were looking at just to get a sense of what the schools were like. So these were kind of a lot of the things that I was dealing with to get settled.
Right.
So yeah.
Okay. All right. And you went over, how you kind of chose where to go. You talked about your considerations. How long did everything take, as you recall, like from the time you and I met to the time you were actually in the U.S.?
I don't recall it actually taking that long. I could be wrong, but Fadi, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe 6 months. I know that you and my husband were working on the visa kind of behind the scenes.
Right.
And, we flew out, we found a house, and then we had an interview in Toronto at the consulate.
Did you find that interview intimidating in Toronto?
No, it's interesting. I actually expected it to be a lot more intimidating. But it was great. I remember that you coached us, and one of the things that you mentioned to us is, answer the questions, but don't elaborate on anything. Just answer the questions as they ask you the questions. And so I didn't answer anything pertaining to my husband's business, but the interview was a lot shorter and much less detailed than what I expected. So I just dressed in, a semi-professional manner. I answered the questions as they asked us, and then we got approved, and we left pretty soon after that. So
Right. And if I do recall, I think at that time it was probably around 5 to 6 months from the time we started to the time you did go. And those times, of course, do vary according to various different consulates and just the backlog in general. With all that we've been through over the last few years. So there is a little bit of there is actually light at the tunnel when it comes to Canadians going to the U.S. because there was a very very long backlog at the U.S. consulate in Toronto. But thankfully, we are in a much better place now than we were before. And interviews are much more attainable on a sooner basis. So
that's
we're thankful for
good
that.
to know. Yeah, I know. I was just going to add that I think our whole interview was maybe 10 minutes, if that.
Right.
I don't recall it being any longer than that. So as I mentioned, I think I was a lot probably more worried at the time, and then after we went through the interview, I thought, wow, that was pretty
Right.
straightforward. So
Yeah, and I mean, when it comes to, in this case, it wasn't you that was the principal, but usually the principal has a the best insight as to the business itself. So answering those questions, it should come as a second nature. And if if the entire application is well put together, then the likelihood of success remains high. Um, and again, like I think you and your spouse were very well prepared, and the applications were as well. And then with the combination of everything together, there end up being so few questions. And yes, a lot
Yeah.
of the clients end up getting they are surprised at what the process does look like at the consulate. I think most people are expecting a very formal
Yes.
process, going into a separate room and sitting at a desk or table and
Yes.
being grilled. But it's not necessarily that. It's more informal than that.
Yes. I think we actually,
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know if it's changed since then, but I know at the time, I think we were actually just standing at a window.
Right.
We weren't even sitting. The only thing I do remember is all the work that actually went into preparing for it. I remember looking, at our file, and there was a business case, and there was a lot of like a big stack of documents. So I realized all the work that was done by your firm
Right.
behind the scenes. But so by the time we got there, they seemed pretty prepared, and there weren't actually a lot of questions.
Right. Okay. Um, just a small question that came up because you do have dogs as well. So how was it to get your dogs across? Was it difficult?
No, it wasn't difficult at all. So we had actually, no, at the time we only had one dog. And what we did is we had friends of ours drive our dog across the border so they could drive our car to Florida so we could fly with the kids. And the only thing, I just needed to go to the vet and get a document confirming that all the vaccinations were up to date. And they went right through the border. Our friends even said the border personnel were very friendly and everything. So it was very easy. We didn't have to put the dog in quarantine or anything like that. They just literally drove down to Florida. So
Right.
it was pretty straightforward.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Michelle. So you talked about what it was like settling in the U.S. In terms of your transition to the green card, and that might be more of a question for myself. I can speak to that. Um, so one of the questions that we get often is once a person is on an E2, what's next? How do we transition to a green card? And and the answer to this is there's not a one size fits all solution because the E2 is considered as a temporary visa. It is not intended to transition to a green card or to permanent residence. But having said that, well, we do have many clients that do go from an E2 to a green card. And again, it's not a one size fits all solution. But in this case, for those that had joined us from the outset, I had mentioned that we were considering doing an L1 or an E2 for Michelle and her family. But we went with the E2 because that would allow for a 5-year visa, right away, once approved, of course. And that was more appealing than going with the L1, which would have been because the U.S. business was less than a year old at that point. It would have been only for a 1-year period, and then we'd have to look at doing the renewal shortly thereafter. So, having said that, Michelle and her family did move to the U.S. on the E2 while the U.S. business continued to build. And so, years later, rather than, if I recall correctly, we did not even do an E2 renewal. We went straight to a green card. And
Yes.
the way we were able to do that is there is a green card option for an intercompany transfer as a senior manager or executive. And that's exactly what we used. So we showed that the principal, in this case, it was Michelle's spouse, um, was employed with the Canadian business for the requisite period of time, which is 1 year in the last 3 years, and that he was being transferred permanently to the U.S. in a similar capacity, which was in a senior managerial or executive role. And that is a green card category. Um, Now, this worked for Michelle, but it's not going to necessarily work for everyone, right? Because, I would say, a good portion of the clients that we work with that actually apply for the E2, they don't always have businesses in Canada or elsewhere or in a different country. In fact, not everyone, even if they did have a business, not everyone's going to maintain that business while being in the U.S. on the E2. So although this worked for Michelle, it doesn't always work for everyone's situation. But I would say that many of our clients end up usually finding a way to apply for a green card. Whether it is like the EB1C as it was here, or in some other format or some other way. For example, sometimes we have our clients. The principal is in the U.S. Focusing on the E2. Meanwhile, the spouse who can get an open work permit, just by virtue of being the spouse of a principal E2 holder and applying for the E2 as a dependent, that creates a lot of opportunity, because the spouse is able to go out and work, with another company perhaps, and maybe that company is going to employ that person, like that person, and say, hey, you know what, we want to keep you here permanently, and we can't find anybody to fill this role. So that could also, I just this is a hypothetical, but that's another way to qualify for a green card. But the method that you took, Michelle, or your family took, I think that was a very, it was very strategic, and it worked out. It worked out well in the long run.
Yeah, it definitely did. And I guess one of the things I would add is, we also get asked a lot, are you happy that you made the move? Did it work out well? And I would absolutely say that, we're thrilled. One of the things that I've really noticed, I guess, just about living in the US that we really like are just, all the opportunities. So, for example, if you don't want to live where we are in Florida, you want to live in another state because of either the tax system or the politics or the weather, or whatever, you feel, there's just so many opportunities and choices. And I know my kids, who are both in college now or university, have had a lot of opportunities there in terms of doing internships and all sorts of things, because the market's so big. And just for us, I guess on a personal note, we've made a lot of friends. It's really been a great 9 years. We've been very happy. So I'm happy that we did it, and it's worked out well for us.
Okay, very good. What advice would you give to someone who is considering immigrating to the U.S. on whether it's on the E2 or another type of visa?
Well, I think like anything, you need to manage your expectations. I mean, when, I tell you that it's worked out for us, it absolutely did work out for us. But it wasn't always easy. There's struggles that you face along the way, and there's cultural differences. I think even more now than when we first moved. So I think, really just to manage your expectations, know that sometimes, life isn't always a straight line. You may come across certain challenges. So for example, one of the big challenges we faced is when we left Canada, we had a very good credit rating. And when we moved to the United States, we had to start all over again. So, that was a big bump, so if you're thinking about getting a mortgage or buying a house, even things like setting up utilities, they want to make sure that you have a credit rating, which we didn't. So that took a little time to build up, making friends, and even the visa process. There were periods, for example, with our green card, we were waiting to get called for our interview, and it was taking longer than expected. And that was stressful. So, there are definitely moments and bumps along the way. So you have to really kind of go in with that expectations. There's great parts of it, but, like anything, not everything's going to be perfect all the time.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Michelle. Um, are there any? It looks like there's going to be some questions here from those that have tuned in. But are there any other tips or resources that you would recommend that potential immigrants to the U.S. may, tap into to sort of prepare themselves of what to expect in the U.S.?
Um, one of the things that really helped us, and maybe this is sounding a little bit cliche, but it really helped us having a good real estate agent because, they really know the neighborhoods, they understand what the good school districts were. They're just such a good resource for settlement issues. So, I would definitely try to find a good real estate agent, maybe through somebody that somebody knows there, or even through an agent in Canada who might know somebody there. I thought that was, a really, really helpful for us. One of the other things, I think I would point out also is, in Canada, where we have a social insurance number that's primarily used, when you're applying for a job. In the United States, they really rely heavily on their social security number. So that's something that you want to try to get very quickly. Whenever you need anything, for example, utilities, or you're signing up for things, they're always asking for your social security number. So that was kind of a big difference from Canada that I noticed. Um, Other resources, I think honestly, you just really have to put yourself out there. One of the things we liked about Florida is it where we live, it's a very kind of transient um, place where you have people coming from all over. So people are very open to meeting new people. Maybe there's parts of the US which you're not going to find that as much. So, you really need to think about where you want to go, why you want to go to that specific area, what you're looking for. Think about all those things first, because it really varies the United States, just culturally, economically, politically, from one state to the next, which is a great thing because you have a lot of choices. But you kind of need to really think about that before you make your decision.
Right. No, very good tips, Michelle. Thank you so much. I do have some audience questions that I want to just get into. Um, and some may not be applicable to you directly, Michelle. So,
Yeah. So,
so can I move with my family from Canada to the U.S. before securing a job in the States? What are our options in the case? I mean, yeah, it's a sort of a broad-based question there. Um, what you can't generally do is no, you can't pick up and move to the U.S. and just live there. You do need some sort of underlying way to remain legally in the U.S. Having a job offer and applying for a some sort of a work authorization or work permit would be appropriate in that case. But there are other options as well, right? There's it's employment based. There could be investment based, as we're speaking about here, with like an E2, if that's possible, or there could be a family based option. Then of course sometimes people go to school and get a student visa, but it's never a good idea just to pick up and move to the U.S. That's generally almost a guarantee that the person's going to be turned away. When CBP actually vets the person and figures out that, hey, this person's trying to move here without proper authorization, that is a reason to deny the person and maybe even get into some more problems, like an expedited removal or some other issues that may come up. What is required to move for work? Do I or the employer have to do the application? Yes. Generally, yes. If you are asking this question because there's already an offer in place and you and your employer do not understand what you need, it is a good idea to get in contact with a firm like ours. Have a exploratory call and understand what options may be available for you and your employer. Can we go into the details on the E2 visa for this specific case? Fees, what amount was needed for investment? What was the actual business plan? Yeah, I'm not gonna get into the details as for Michelle's case, but I mean, just generally speaking, we handle many E2 applications, and we've seen all kinds of E2 applications for some businesses that you wouldn't even really imagine. But generally speaking, the first of all, the investment amount, that's going to really vary according to the business that the person has set up in the U.S. Right. And I don't know if anyone has tuned in before, if you've seen this, if you've heard this example before, it's a lot different to set up, for example, a car dealership in the U.S. and what that expectation of an investment would be versus, as an example, setting up a consulting business in the U.S. Right. One requires an expensive stock of product, and one does not require stock of any product whatsoever, as an example. So the actual investment amount does vary, as do even our fees. I mean, we have a sort of general fees that we do charge, but depending on the nature of the case, there could be some fluctuations between one case to another, and and our videos are also recorded. They're going to be available on YouTube. I don't want somebody 5 years from now watching this and say, "Hey, you said it's going to cost this much on this video." Meanwhile, it's outdated. But it's best if you are seriously considering and moving to the U.S. on the E2. I think it's going to be worth your while to set up a call. Again, it's an exploratory call. You're not committing to anything. It's just a matter of going through, understanding what your situation is, and whether there's a sort of a pathway for you to qualify, whether it's an E2 or something else. Again, sometimes clients are pleasantly surprised. They come into a meeting thinking one thing: I'm going to go. I want to apply for this. This is what I want to do. But there might be some other options that are available. And that happens quite frequently, right? Sometimes someone comes in saying, I want to apply for an E2. Meanwhile, they've had a business, for example, in Canada, and they've been doing a lot of business in the US. So we might say, well, you can do an E2, but there's also an E1 option for you as well, right? Which is a treaty trader visa. So there are usually, what we would do on our end is sort of take everything in its totality and decide what the sort of the best path moving forward is for that individual, just like we did with Michelle and her family.
Yeah, Fadi, one of the things I wanted to add also, I think for the E2 that we had, which I know we really appreciated, is the fact that I was able to work and my kids were able to work. So my son was able to work in the summer. I was able to work, if I wanted to work. So that was, specifically to the E2 visa, that was very helpful knowing that for us.
Right. Okay. All right. Yeah. Thank you, Michelle. There is another question. Just let me pull that up. Okay. I have a parent who is American but lives in Canada, and half my family lives in the United States. But my uncle said he would sponsor me, and I would live at his residence in the meantime. What would be the best application for me to do that move? Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of information that can be used here to answer. It's probably best again to to schedule a call and let myself or our team have an exploratory call with you. But I can speak to this generally. If you have a U.S. parent that lives in Canada, the problem I see there is that there might be a domicile issue. So you may have a parent that lives in Canada that's an American, and an American parent may sponsor you. That parent would need to either be living in the U.S. or at least have the intent to live in the U.S. Right, and that's the key. In terms of having an uncle that's willing to sponsor you, in terms of family members that are eligible for sponsorship, that would need to come from a spouse, parent, child, or sibling. So uncles, aunts, cousins are not part of the mix, right? Sometimes an uncle or aunt may sponsor a parent, if that makes sense. And if the person is young enough and can qualify as a derivative, then that may work out for the individual. But I do not have any more details here, as from the question being asked at least, and it's probably best to have a one-on-one call with our office. Okay, there's another question. So how do I get a TN visa? What documents are required for a TN visa, and how difficult is the interview process at the border? Okay, yeah. So for a Canadian, sorry, let me just step back for a moment. Only Canadian and Mexican nationals can apply for a TN, right? In the case of a Canadian can apply for a TN right at the port of entry, or the application can be made through the service center, have the service center adjudicate it, and then take the approval notice, and then make your way into the U.S. But the advantage to applying in person is that the adjudication is done on the spot, right? So the person that's applying is expected to have all their paperwork in order, and show up at the port of entry, tell the officer that you're applying for TN status, and then the officer will send you off into secondary inspection, and at secondary inspection you can present your paperwork and your application. Now the officer is likely going to have questions for you, and those questions could vary depending on the nature of your application. There are some occupations that are I would say a lot more scrutinized than others. But generally speaking, you should have, and again, this is just very generic, you should have an offer letter, and the offer letter should be stated in a certain way that's going to be appropriate for TN purposes. And the TN offer letter is from the company addressed to the individual. There's also a support letter, and the support letter is typically from the company addressed to CBP or to the USCIS if it's being sent off through the service center. And then the appropriate supporting documents, which may be educational documents, could be letters of reference, maybe licenses or certificates. All of that, along with typically the resume, is what would be included with the application. Can you qualify without your profession being on the NAFTA occupation list? Example, RN is on the nurse, but I'm currently working licensed as a paramedic. Similar roles, can I qualify as a paramedic? Generally not. No, it's the TN. There is a TN occupation list, and with that TN occupation list, there's an expectation that the role is going to fall within one of those occupations. But although there is the RN is an occupation on this list, paramedic is not, and it's not. I wouldn't say it's something that's very close, to what an RN is, and it would not qualify as far as I'm concerned. And we do a lot of TNs, by the way, as well. All right. I want to become a U.S. permanent resident. I know already which state and city. I already have a place to stay. Which visa should I apply for? Can I also transfer my Canadian degree to a U.S. degree to make a job application easier? What are the documentations needed to do so? I've been looking for info, but I would like to validate if it's all accurate. Yeah, and again, it's many people would like to become permanent residents, but having a pathway to becoming a permanent resident usually comes through whether it's an employment based, family based, it could be investment based. There are also some other options, but those are really the three main buckets to really focus on. And there's just not enough information here. You're probably better off again to book an appointment with myself or one of our team members, so we can have an exploratory meeting with you and figure out whether there is a pathway for permanent residence for you. Okay. Sorry, just let me see here. I think that answers most of the questions. Thank you again, Michelle, for joining me on this event here today. I think it's been very informative for our current audience and an audience for the future. And it is it just gives some some more some very good insight as to what a person can anticipate going to the U.S. Any last words on your end?
I don't really know if I have anything else to add, other than, if it's something that you really want to do. I know, in our cases I mentioned earlier on, this really was a decision that my husband really wanted to do initially. Though, in retrospect, I'm so happy that we did, because in our case, it's just turned out great. We're very happy being there. But, I would say if it's something that you really want to do, I would definitely, at the very least, take the next step and, meet with an immigration professional, find out, the viability of it, because it's worth it. I look back at all the great years that we've had in the US, and, I just think it was a great decision for us, and I'm really happy that we took the plunge. And I always, I said to my husband initially, at the very worst case scenario, we can always go back. We're Canadian citizens and we can always go back. So for us, we just felt it was really worth it. So I think I would just end on that note.
Okay, very good. Thank you again, Michelle,
Thank you.
for joining, and I'm sure we'll be in contact soon.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.